Hello, my amazing Algebra Half students. This is Mrs. A, and I love math. And today we're doing lesson 41, which is all about reciprocals. And here we go. 2/5 is the reciprocal of 5/2. So what do we have to do to get a reciprocal? We just take the fraction and flip it upside down. The 5 went from the bottom to the top, and the 2 went from the top to the bottom. How easy is that? 1/4 is the reciprocal of 4/1, but 4/1 is equal to 4. So 4 has a reciprocal that is 1/4, because 4 can be written as 4/1, and I flip it over and I get 1/4. Now there's one number that has no reciprocal, and that is 0. 0 could be written as 0/1 because every integer value can be written as 0/1. But when I flip 0 over, it makes no sense. We can't divide by 0 because when we're dividing, that assumes we're dividing into a certain number of groups, and 0 groups makes no sense. So although 0 is a number, 1/0 is not even a number. It is an undefined term. Therefore, 0 has no reciprocal, and it is the only number that has no reciprocal. Okay, so another special rule. Any number times its reciprocal equals 1. All right, so here's an example. 4/1, which is 4, times 1/4, which is its reciprocal, equals 4/4, and any number over itself is 1. 2/5 times 5/2 is 10/10 equals 1. Now we'll define what a coefficient is. A coefficient is a number that is in front of a variable, and that coefficient is multiplied by that variable. So 4x means 4 times x. And now we're going to talk about the multiplication property of equality, which your book calls something a little different. Your book calls this the multiplication rule for equations. Both sides of an equation can be multiplied by the same number except 0 without changing the solution to the equation. Okay, our first problem, we're going to use the multiplication property of equality, or the multiplication rule for equations. And notice that we have 4x, but we really want to get x by itself. So we can multiply by its reciprocal. So here, remember, 4 is 4/1, so we can multiply by 1/4 as long as we multiply the other side also by 1/4. And this 12 is also a 12/1, isn't it? So the 1 and the 1 and the 4 and the 4 will cancel because a reciprocal times the number is 1, and we end up with x by itself is 12 divided by 4, which is 3. So x is 3. Now let's take that back up and check it. If we take x as 3, back up here to the original equation, so let's take out that part. We go back to the original and we plug in a 3, and we get 4 times 3 is 12, and that works. Okay, well, now while we're looking at this, let's make a little extension here. Would it matter even one little bit if instead of multiplying by 1/4, what if I just divided both sides by 4? Okay, now division is the same thing as multiplication by the reciprocal. So when you're thinking how to get rid of the 4, you can divide each side by 4 because that's exactly the same as multiplying each side by the reciprocal of 4, because the reciprocal is 1/4, which is 1 divided by 4. So dividing by 4 on both sides is perfectly legal, and the multiplication property of equality really applies to both multiplication and division, just like the addition property of equality applies to both addition and subtraction. We can always change a subtraction into addition of the opposite, and we can always change division into multiplication by a reciprocal. So they are equivalent operations. So we can multiply or divide by the same non-zero number on both sides. And notice we would still get x equals 3 when we divided 12 by 4. And that's just another way to do the same problem. Okay, here are 2 more before we get to our practice problems. So we're trying to get the x by itself. So we will multiply to get rid of the 2/3. We will multiply by the reciprocal, which is 3/2. But if we multiply one side by 3/2, we must multiply the other side by the same number. So now the 3's and the 2's, it becomes 6/6, which is 1. And we wind up with x equals, and now we have to multiply this, 3/10. And that would be our answer. Okay, so if we wanted to go back and check that, we would go back to the original, and 2/3, let's just plug this in. We're only looking at the purple right now because of all this we wrote on there, but 2/3 times 3/10 gives me 6/30, or remember the 3's could cancel, and the 2 and the 10 could cancel, and I would have 1/5. So 6/30 is 1/5, and it works. Okay, so let's look at this one. Now, we can think of this x/3. We could multiply both sides by 3, okay, because we want to get rid of the 3 there. Or we could think of this x/3 as the same thing as 1/3 x. So you can take the 3 from the denominator and pull it out as a coefficient, and then it's easier to see maybe that we're going to multiply by 3 and we're going to multiply by 3. So we end up with this canceling, and we get x is 18. If we left the x, the 3 under the x, then we would still try to get rid of the 3. Since it's divided by 3, we're going to multiply by 3, because the inverse operations undo each other, don't they? And we get the same answer. The 3 on the top and the 3 on the bottom will cancel each other out, and we get 18. Now let's do some practices. Okay, so we have 2 practices on the board. I hope you will copy them down and then go do them yourself before you watch the rest. So pause your video. Okay, so we have a fraction in front of our x. We want to get rid of the fraction to get the x by itself. So we will multiply by the reciprocal, which is 11/5, and we must also go over here to the other side and multiply by 11/5. Okay, so 55/55 is 1, but we can also just cancel the top and the bottom and the top. As long as we're always canceling things on top and bottom, it still turns out to be 1. So we end up with x equals, and then here we have a 1 underneath our 7, 77/5. Now 77/5 is an improper fraction. So we're going to have to do what? Some long division here. 77 divided by 5 is going to go 1, and 1 times 5 is 5, and we subtract and get 2. Bring down the 7. 5 into 27 is 5. 5 times 5 is 25, and we have a remainder of 2. So 77/5 is the same as 15 2/5. Okay, so my final answer for this one would be x is 15 2/5. Okay, so that was a lot on that board. Okay, so now this other one's not going to be quite as long, I don't think. So we won't give it quite as much space. Okay, so we have 5/3 times x. We want to get just the x, so we're going to multiply by 3/5. But over here, we will also multiply by 3/5. Okay, so now when we cancel all this out, we get x is 12. This is going to be a 1 under there, right? So 12/5. And that one I can do kind of in my head because 5 goes into 12. It's improper, so we need to turn it around. 5 goes into 12 2 whole times, and that's 10. And then there are 2 left over, so 2/5. So that one is 2 2/5, and this one was 15 2/5. So I'll let you look at those carefully. Get them down on your paper if you missed any part of those two problems. Okay, so here we're going to multiply by the reciprocal of 2/3 to get rid of the 2/3. So we'll multiply by 3/2, but we must also do the same thing on the other side, 3/2. And then this is going to cancel to 1, and we get x is 3/8. And 3/8 can't be simplified any further. Okay, this one's very simple. We are going to either divide by 3 on both sides, which is fine, or we can multiply by 1/3. Divide by 3 and divide by 3 works just dandy. So we end up with x is 5. You will get the same answer if you multiply by 1/3 on both sides. Try it. Here we have our last two practice problems. So copy them down and pause your video. Okay, on this one, we have the 3 on the bottom. To get rid of it, we will multiply by 3 on both sides. So we will multiply by 3 on this side, multiply by 3 on this side, and we end up being able to cancel those and get x is 15. And that is just one way to do it. The other way to do it would be, if that's too hard, you can say, okay, that x/3 is really the same thing as 1/3 x. Isn't that the same as x/3, 1/3 times x? And then you can see that the 3/1 is the reciprocal, and you still get the same answer. And the last problem, we have a 4 on the top. We multiply by 1/4, or we can divide by 4. Multiply by 1/4 or divide by 4. Because we have our fraction over here, I think this one will be easiest if we just multiply by 1/4 and multiply by 1/4, because this one is already in a fractional form. So now this is going to go away, and we're going to get x is 1/12. And that is the end of our lesson. So now it's time for you to go do your homework. And this is Mrs. A, and may God bless your day.